Thank you for being here. We've been planning to get together with you for some time, and alhamdulillah, now is the opportunity for us. Let us talk a little bit about your own, how should I say, transitions that have brought you into Islam. Maybe that would be of interest, and then we'll go into other things.
Well, I'm originally from California. My father was a university professor in Northern California, and on my mother's side, actually, they've been in California for over 100 years, so it's an old Californian family. And I was raised, Christian background. My father was Catholic, my mother's Greek Orthodox, but I was actually, if anything, more towards the Greek Orthodox side. And then 1977, I became Muslim, which was very early on for me, just at my age.
How old were you?
I was 17.
You were 17.
Mm-hmm. And I think from then just began a journey that took me several different places. I've studied in the Middle East, and I ended up in West Africa and Northern Africa.
But before you get into your odyssey, you said that you became a Muslim at the age of 17.
Right.
What brought about this change? I mean, was there something extraordinary that was happening in your life, or were there influences that, or was it just your own?
No, I think it's interesting because statistics have shown that conversion of people to interreligiously, but also intra-religiously, usually occurs between the ages of 12 and 21, which people don't realize that, but it's actually more common for people of a younger age to have religious inclinations than at an older age. And I think maybe some people tend to find religion, or at least a spiritual tradition, because I was much more interested in spirituality than religion at that age. I think
that is unusual, though. I mean, spirituality is a heavy topic.
I think for me it was a confrontation with death at an early age. I was in a serious car accident, and that began a journey of reflection just about death and the nature of life, and also coming to terms with the fact, because I think as individuals, all of us at a certain point in our lives suddenly become aware of our mortality. And for some people, I mean, you're a physician, so I think you know that for some people it happens quite late in life,
that perhaps never happens.
Or never happens at all until those last moments.
Like even in the Quran points that story of Pharaoh, I mean, at the end, yes.
So people, I think, just the idea of mortality is something hit me very early on in life, and looking death very close, up front, I think will give somebody an introspective perspective, and that's what happened to me. And then it began a search, because I was in Catholic schools, and so I'd been exposed to religion quite a bit, and I really, although I think there's a lot of positive things to religion, I think there's a lot of very negative things as well. And
that can be said about any religion, though.
No, any religion, and I'm using religion in a very broad sense of how we live our lives, right? But particularly, absolutely, I feel how religion manifests in human cultures is problematic.
Well, that's interesting. We'll come back to looking at the religion and faith and spirituality a little bit later.
All right.
But so that after having gone through an experience, I sort of tend to think that a lot of people who convert have some defining moment of this kind. Do you agree, or?
Well, this is another fascinating topic. If you look at one of the great conversions in the Islamic tradition is Umar ibn al-Khattab, and we know that he was literally on his way to kill the Prophet, peace be upon him. And by the time he gets to the door, I mean, there's a whole side scenario that takes place of going to his sisters. But in the same day, by the time he gets to the door, he's converting to the way of Islam. So conversions, it's a really unusual thing.
You're saying that there's also this higher dimension.
I think there's so many
Yes.
variables involved
Yes.
with conversion itself that it's very hard. People have asked me, how did you become Muslim? And I find that a really hard a question to answer, simply because you're dealing with such a multidimensional situation.
Yeah.
And there's so many variables. From one perspective, we could say that our journey to whatever unfolds in our life begins literally with inception. And there's an argument, and it certainly is the Islamic one, that it begins prior to inception. So, you know, we can look at it materialistically and say, well, this happened and this happened. I was having an identity crisis, which according to Erickson's psychosocial theory, I mean, this is what happens during that period of time.
Yes.
We're trying to resolve our identity and things like that. So we can look at it from a materialistic perspective, but I don't think it's simply can be limited to that, although there's certainly that element exists, and I wouldn't deny that.
Yeah, but I think by the same token, the kind of experience that sometimes people can look back to when they were either looking at imminent death, or I mean, I have this conversation with my patients also sometimes who are going through that, and then they say very clearly that something intrinsically or internally happens to them, and their whole view of life changes.
Well, this is called fitra, right? I mean, this is what the Quran calls fitra, which is the inherent nature. And I think what happens, which is fascinating, because my own time of working in critical care, which was for about 4 years, and dealing with patients, and I was in a cardiac unit, so I was dealing with people that were dealing with heart attacks, and it's fascinating to see a vista open up to people that are confronted with their mortality, and it can be closed very quickly. And oftentimes it's the physician who is complicit in the closing of that vista, because they'll remind them that this is, you know, things are okay. All you need to do, I think, you know, you've had a slight infarct. There's not a lot of damage to the tissue. You can have a good long life if you just, you know, cut down on the fat, lower your cholesterol and things like this. And suddenly you see, within a period of a day or so, a patient who has had this impact, in which they're saying, wow, I need to look at my priorities and what's important in life and where am I going and suddenly they're back on the phone calling, and I think my doctor says I can get back to work by, you know, 2 weeks or a week. And so it's fascinating. So I think vistas do open up for human beings. And I, at the age of 17, chose to you know, to enter into that vista and really to explore it to its fullest, and it ended up in my conversion to Islam. And I think that somebody would have a very similar experience as I did, and they might look at and get interested at that vista, but turn and get on with life, and I didn't, and it's been a defining moment for me in my life and a turning point.
But you said that you used that moment when the pathway opened to get into Islam. Well, why Islam though? At that time, if you
well, I think what happened to me is that I became interested in after death, in what happens after death, and I began to study various traditions, what they said, and I think I was already disappointed with the Christian tradition in many ways, and partly because it's just history. I was just studying. I find, you know, European history is really embarrassing for European Americans. But I got interested in looking at after-death scenarios. And I think of all the traditions, because my background is also comparative religion and university background, which I went into later obviously, because I did the nursing, and then I went into comparative religion. But if you look at comparative religion tradition, I think what you find is that really Islam has added more to the after-death scenario than any other tradition prior to it.
Though Christianity has.
But they don't have a great detailed account of literally what takes place. And what I find fascinating is work like of Raymond Moody's Life After Life and different books. And I actually at 17 went to see him lecture.
That's interesting.
And I got interested in near-death experiences because that's really kind of what I had. And I find it fascinating that many of the experiences that people have are very similar to what has been defined by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as what happens after death. And one of the signs of the latter days of the human experience, according to the Islamic tradition, is that people will be brought back from death. This is in the hadith literature or the traditions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
But actually, we'll get towards the what Islam says in terms of a hereafter. But I'm just keeping track of your story presently, and so that after this moment, of this defining moment, if I may put it, you looked at Islam because you were studying.
I was just looking at various religions. I was looking at different traditions, and particularly with this after death. And, you know, Islam, it's changing now, but this is 1977, probably 76, 77, prior to the Iranian revolution and what was happening then. And Islam is just, you know, it's the last place people look in the United States, traditionally.
Were you up in San Francisco?
I mean, you'd look at Hinduism, Buddhism, probably Shintoism or Taoism before somebody'd think about looking at Islam. You know, because there's just such a negative stereotypical image of Islam and the Muslims. And it's also, there's this incredibly anti-intellectual backlash that, I mean, Islam is what one of my father's friends, who was a lawyer, educated person in this country, they were just in conversation, mentioned that Islam was an idiot's religion. And my father said, well, you know, my son's a Muslim actually, and I don't think he's an idiot.
Well, that's interesting. But you see, you brought up another topic which needs some reflection here, and that is that you said the impression of Islam compared to other religions is so terribly negative. Of course, there is a reason for it, and I don't know.
It's historical, and there's a lot of reasons for it, and certainly the historical tension that existed between Christianity and Islam for centuries. I mean, Gibbon, who penned the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, said that the debate, he termed the war between Christianity and Islam as the Great Debate.
Right.
And so that Europe has always felt the pressure of Islam at its borders, and has had several wars with the Muslims over the centuries.
Right.
But I think that that what's happened in the West is that religion in general has a negative. It has a negative perception, and part of it is you know, the Enlightenment period. Of recognizing that the religion, by and large, is fairy tales. I mean, this is something, and this is what a lot of modern research has clearly shown, that we're dealing with mythological conditions in which books were written, and pre-scientific, pre-rational, magical worldviews were presented.
Yeah, but that's only one aspect of it. I mean, one can look at that argument and say, well, yes,
it's a strong argument, though.
It is. It is partly there, but I don't think that one can dismiss the entire, you know, substance of any faith by saying that this is what
a lot of scientists do. A lot of modern people do. I mean, I think that's one of the refreshing things about Islam, is that Islam it's really kind of freed religion from a lot of pre-Enlightenment thinking. I mean, Islam to me is in many ways, it's radically postmodern in its approach. Because
you use the expression postmodern, we are falling into a debate again of semantics, and whether that term which has been coined is valid in terms of applying to Islam. However, if you examine the polls that are generated, one of the recent polls that I saw was from Pew Foundation or what have you, and in that poll they said that 95% of the people in America believed in God, and a substantial number of them believed in religion. If you took those,
well, this is fitrah. I mean, belief in God is an inherent part of the human creature. I mean, we're stuck with this, whether people like it or not. This is something fundamental to our being, is that from the time a child is little, it's looking for the cause of things. It's asking, why did that happen? What made that sound? What did this? I mean, this is something you see, search for cause. And ultimately, the great question is, how did we get here? What is all this stuff? I mean, where did this flesh and blood come from? Where did this incredible synergistic biological species come from? You know, where did this eye, who designed the eye? Because we obviously see the form and function of the eye very clearly, and it would indicate that there is some type of intelligence behind the thing.
No, I think,
so I think people reject this statistical, billions of years of random cosmic
no,
muck.
I think that whole theory that science has advanced, that given the right set of circumstances, the world can create itself, is by and large rejected on the basis of what you just said, either fitra or intuitively people rejecting this whole notion. So I think that is becoming more and more clear.
But religion, the belief in religion, ultimately, to use the masses as some kind of justification for religion, I think is not really, most people don't know anything about their tradition. I would grant it that most Muslims don't know about their own tradition.
Same as the Christians.
And this is what I meant about Islam being radically postmodern, is in the sense that one of the things that Islam confronts you with is, why are you the way you are? I mean, you're just a product of the culture that you were born in. And this is something that I became aware of, at an early age, is the only reason I'm a Christian is because my parents are Christian. The only reason
it's a congenital condition.
It's a congenital condition, and I really haven't given it a whole lot of thought. I mean, I was taught that there's a Santa Claus. I was taught that there's an Easter Bunny. Had I grown up in Sri Lanka or in, it would have been something, in West Africa they call it girfaf. They scare people. Instead of the boogeyman, they say girfaf. It's this, bear-like creature that comes out and snatches little kids that don't do what their parents say. So, I mean, you're going to be defined by this cultural environment you're in, and this historical productivity, that we see that produces people and their worldviews is something that the Quran says, think about this.
Yes, no, I think that...
should you just be following this thing just because your parents are doing it?
No, I think that aspect of the spirit of rational inquiry that the Quran emphasizes to the nth degree, it's something which
what I'm pointing out here, I think, is that it's looking at something, not just rational inquiry, it's looking at something really, really deep here, which is, who are you? Mm-hmm. How did your being get formulated to the point where you have all these ideas and opinions? I mean, have you really given these things a lot of thought? I mean, this is this is late 19th century, this is Nietzschean, this is late 19th century, early 20th century Heideggerian questioning about one's, Heidegger called it your thrownness, right? But, I mean, it's fascinating. The Quran, Ibrahim, the prophet Abraham in the Quran, when he points out the stupidity of worshiping idols, and at one point they say to him, well, who broke the idols? And he said, the big one did it. And they said, the big one can't do anything. He said, well, then why are you worshiping them?
That's
if they can't do any. And then it says in the Quran a beautiful expression, raja'u, it says they return to themselves.
Right.
In other words, hey, he's got a point here. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And suddenly this is the vista opening up. Yes. And they chose to not follow it. They said, this is what we found our fathers doing. Mm-hmm. And that is a radical... The other thing...
Paradigm shift, actually.
It's a paradigm shift.
Right.
And you can either go with it or become the Inquisition that wants to put out anybody that's forcing you to have to think about, the radical implications of the new paradigm that's emerging.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were pursuing this journey of yours. Now, you have just had a defining moment or experience, and then you already are pursuing the study of Islam, and then later on you go to college or...
Actually, I was in my first semester of college, and when I became Muslim, I left that, in fact. And then I went to England, and...
At the age of 17?
Yeah.
And your parents just sort of...
I actually became Muslim like a month or so before my 18th birthday. Mm-hmm. And so, I left. I spent a short time here, I think about 6 months.
Yes.
And then after that, I left. And I think initially, when you become, when you do something that radical, like changing your entire way of life, your entire way of thinking. And Islam is not, Islam is quite monolithic in its approach.
But was it an agreeable parting with your parents, or at that time, or did it strain your relationship?
No, I think initially it was just difficult for my parents to understand. Mm-hmm. And both my parents are university educated, very broad-minded people. I mean, my father was a humanities professor, and very philosophical inclinations in his worldview. And my mother went to Berkeley, and that says enough.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, you know, she was very active in the civil rights movement. I mean, I grew up, you know, she took me when I was 12 to the Soledad brothers.
Oh, yes. It was in the 60s, yes.
Yeah, to George Jackson's prison trial, just to see, you know, what was happening, that there were political struggles going on in this country. She was very opposed to the Vietnam War. So I did grow up
with a lot of awareness of
with a lot of awareness, social awareness, very much so, and certainly about the inequities in our culture. System. You know, because we grew up in an area that is, you know, probably a more wealthier area. I mean, my family, my close family, there's wealth in my family. My particular family was not wealthy at all. So I did not grow up wealthy by any means. In fact, quite probably more the other end.
But idea-wise,
but definitely the area we were in was quite wealthy, and so I think my mother was, you know, wanted to make us sure that we understood that this country has a lot of inequities. So, you know, my sister was in Selma, Alabama, marching with, you know, I mean, that's the type background that we were raised in. And the 60s was a fascinating time in this country. You know, Berkeley was right across the street from where I grew up, quite literally. I mean, it wasn't far at all. And we were aware that there were big things happening, you know, in the States. So I think initially, you know, my parents, they were just perplexed more than anything. And my mother's always been very accepting of whatever any of her children have done. So
you went to England, and then you
I went to England, and I was with a community there, and was studying, and they were probably more spiritually inclined, and although there was a
were these the Naqshbandis or
but probably there was a lot of political emphasis too, that Islam is a spiritual political movement. It's not politics without spirituality, and it's not spirituality with politics. So there was, I think, a balance.
You still agree with that, or you?
Oh, very much so. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have a personal and a social transaction here.
Yes.
You know?
Right.
So I spent a few years in that community, and then what I.
But you're not doing anything particularly. You were just.
I was studying. I think I was studying very seriously.
Yes.
But then at a certain point, I realized that I wanted to learn Arabic because I wanted to get into the sources, you know, to really experience Islam from the source. And I think being at that age, because I'm still only at this point about 22, for me, it was still probably one of these things that could go either way. You know, there were a lot of people dabbling in religions in the 60s and 70s, and, you know, you become a Buddhist for a few years. And
right. The transitions are, you know.
Yeah, so people did their religion thing in the 60s and 70s.
60s was very much into sort of.
And early 70s also.
Yeah.
You know, it started changing with, you know, I mean, certainly 69 was a big turning point because of the Manson thing that happened in this country. But, you know, and then Jonestown was a major disaster to the idea of communities and religious communities. So I think those things were going on, but I definitely wanted to study the tradition from its sources, and I got the opportunity from a Shaykh who was from Sharjah, Shaykh Abdullah Ali Mahmoud, who was kind of a minister without portfolio.
He was in England at that time.
He was in England, and I met him, and I was just starting to learn Arabic. Right. And he gave me an opportunity to go to the Emirates, and so I went to the United Arab Emirates, and I entered into a Islamic institute there in Al Ain, and I studied there, and I spent 4 years there, and then I actually became an imam in a small mosque and
in Sharjah.
In Al Ain.
In Al Ain.
Yeah, and I lived there, and alhamdulillah, it was a very good experience for me. And then during that time, I had met West African scholars and became very interested in traditional Islam that was still being taught in West Africa. And I started studying with them personally, and I had one of them actually ended up living with me in the apartment that I was living at, and teaching me personally. So I learned a lot during that period. And then I decided to actually go to
West Africa.
Yeah, West Africa. And that began a whole another journey.
So there you spent quite a bit of time, as I understand.
Yeah, I was overseas almost 10 years.
Yeah. And there again, you were just learning or teaching, or
no, I was pretty much committed just to learning, and I was a mu'adhin
where was this
at
now?
one mosque in Al Ain.
Yes.
Because I didn't want to live anymore in the institute's dorm, because they were very young. I don't think a lot of them were as serious as I was, and they were just young high school students, and I was a little older. And I think I was probably more serious about what I was doing. Not all of them. I mean, certainly there were some very good people, but I didn't like the environment. So I asked somebody who was at the Ministry of Endowments, Religious Endowments, if they could work out a situation where I could be a mu'adhin and just live in, because the mosques have in those countries, they have living quarters next to them for the mu'adhin and for the imam. So I didn't take money for the work that I was doing. I had a stipend from this institute, not very much, but
it was enough to get by.
Yeah, and so they let me do that. I was a mu'adhin, and I lived in the mosque. And then I became, after a year of doing that, I learned not very much, but I learned the last portions of the Quran quite well, and could write them, recite them well. So they let me become an imam in another mosque that was near there.
Yes.
And people were very generous to me. That they used to bring me food and things like that.
But you were now, going through several different cultures all of a sudden within a short period of time, in about 5-10 years.
Yeah. And
here you were up in Northern California, having exposure to Berkeley and all the things that you alluded to, going to England where different culture practically, I mean, although it's Western culture, but then you were interacting with different people. Now, in all of this, your obvious contact with was Muslims, and they were from many different parts of the world, as I understand.
So what was happening?
But yes, that was the question.
Well, that's a good question, and I think for me it was a big shock, because I think when I became Muslim here, I had no idea, because I knew so little about Islam and about Muslim cultures and about Muslim peoples, and I mean really vague ideas in my mind about. And then suddenly, as all this Hollywood stupidity starts reemerging into the subconscious, Saracens with their sabers at the gates, Allahu Akbar, and Sinbad, and all this nonsense coming out of the subconscious. So yeah, that thrust me on just having a look at a whole. And that was a big shock for me, realizing first of all.
Did it make you sort of doubt your sanity about or your validity of going into Islam at that point? The reason I ask that is...
that's a good question, because I think there was a period early on in which I did start questioning that. Have I done the right thing? Is this really... And I think that is part of what really inspired me to want to study the teaching deeply.
That's interesting.
Just to find out, I've given up my past, my background, in a sense, my country. It was a very alienating experience. And now I'm kind of wondering, looking around at the Muslims and the prospects of the Muslims, it was kind of discouraging. And so, I think that's a good question, because I think I did have that period. And it's hard, we have this fascinating self-delusional states in which we try to remember what actually happened, and we often create, inventing memory is a fascinating thing, because I've tried to do this repiece. Did this really happen, or did and in many ways, I mean, I think this whole idea of past lives is just our own lives. It's not about living, I mean, how many lives have you had? Have you thought about that? It's fascinating.
I'm still thinking about it.
Exactly. You think the time when you're a student, wow, that was a past life for me.
That's right.
My pre-Islamic life was a past life for me. My childhood was a past life. So I think reincarnation is just... It happens in our own lifetime, No,
actually, the reason I asked also this question is that I've sat across with different people who have converted, and when I've asked them after conversion whether they relented at any point, whether they had any doubts, it's always that they say that it happened when they suddenly met a whole lot of Muslims, and with their diversity and complexity and their attitudes and the whole interaction, to some of them was very negative. And they said, well, we were really, really closed off. And
well, I've always had mixed, I think, you know, on the one hand, yeah, there's massive negativity. On the other hand, there's all these things that we in the West have lost, that the Muslims still have considerable amounts of community. You know, family is still very strong. Also, just social relations. I mean, for instance, you know, you and I have not known each other a great deal of time, and yet, you know, already bonds are formed very quickly amongst the Muslims that don't happen amongst people in the West very often. It's quite rare, and yet it's quite common in the Muslim world. So I think that...
So you think that then Islam is the sort of leveling factor here, which reduces these barriers amongst Muslims?
That's a good question. I think definitely that when you become a Muslim, or being a Muslim, is a very powerful force that is not the same as being a Christian, or not the same as being a Buddhist or a Hindu or some other religion. I think that the brotherhood that exists in Islam is much more powerful than I've seen in other traditions. And that is not to deny that there are communities of Christians that don't have deep, deep brotherhood, but I'm talking about this universal, more global outlook. I think the Amish, for instance, probably have much better community than you'll find almost anywhere in the Muslim world.
Much better support group and much more of a network.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, you might find in the Swat Valley in Pakistan, or the Hunzas, or you know, or in the Caucasus Mountains or somewhere. But you know, community is a disappearing phenomenon. I mean, some people consider it irrelevant in the informational period, that it was necessary in agricultural societies where you need people to stick together and help each other. But when you have these massive megalithic cities in which you've got this state apparatus, but the state apparatus is falling apart.
Yes, of course.
I mean, and now there's this whole modern, you know, communitarianism, they call it, which is an attempt at reestablishing communities even within inner cities.
There's a new book, Bowling Alone. You read that?
I haven't seen it.
That's by a guy from the East Coast, Putman, who's postulating this whole thing that America is now becoming very different from what it used to be, where there were bowling clubs and you would go bowling and there would be opportunity for bonding.
I actually did read an article
bonding
about
and
that.
all of that.
Sure.
So anyway, going back again, the reason I asked about Islam as a leveling sort of...
You know what hit me, and probably what silenced me, is the word leveling.
Yeah.
Because this, you know, Kierkegaard's, one of his ideas about the nihilistic age that we're in is that it levels everything.
Yeah,
and he used it as a very negative term.
Right, not quite.
So when
in
you
that
use
sense.
that word, it kind of silenced me. I don't know if that was the appropriate word.
May not be.
I think
equalizing would be a better word, I think, because I think, the reason I asked also was Malcolm had that same experience when, I mean,
when he went
what
on
really,
Hajj.
What really sort of...
Well, Hajj is a definitely leveling experience.
Yeah, but still, he as much as there was that spiritual bonding which occurs in Hajj and all of that, but to see the humanity interacting with yourself at that level of equality was, I thought, what...
well, this is one of the fascinating, again, you know, one of the conditions that we're finding ourselves in is that provincialism is increasingly becoming detrimental to the human condition, because massive groups of peoples of different backgrounds and cultures are thrust together in mega cities like Los Angeles and Burbank and these places, and suddenly it's, you know, you've got a Korean for a neighbor, or you've got a Vietnamese for a neighbor, and your son might have been in Vietnam. And suddenly it's having to deal with human beings that are very different from yourself. And I think that's one of the things that Islam does to us, is that it forces us to deal with otherness in a way that is not alienating, but is in fact bonding.
Part of human nature.
And what you know, the otherness of color, of language, is broken down by the sameness of belief that transcends whatever differences that people do have at these exterior levels, that ultimately our basic impulses are pretty fundamental. I mean, we're dealing with people that want the best for their family.
Yes.
This is a universal human situation. Right. We're dealing with people that want to live harmoniously, that don't want to be violated or violate others. I mean, I think the vast majority of human beings share some pretty fundamental, basic virtues.
And all religions have the same core of values, more or less, to that extent.
It's just how do we achieve them?
Absolutely.
This is the crisis. I mean, we can all agree, let's all be human. Right?
Yes, but how do you do that?
How do we become human? Yes. And this is where the whole issue becomes problematic, and I think this is where Islam's agenda for humanizing people is so radical.
Well, I don't know whether you would call it agenda. It's a process, I think.
Well, I'm using agenda. See, we're looking at negative terms. Agenda can be,
Yes.
I mean, Islam does have an agenda, and its agenda is to transform people into kind of crude semblances of Bani Adam, or the Adamic species, to a true Adamic being, a true human being. I mean, I definitely think
that's... With a conscience.
With a conscience.
Right.
And the most radical way of doing that is having people pray together 5 times a day.
Yes, of course, yes.
You know, you're praying in a line, in a rank, with people, a black man is on your right side, a white man's on your left side, a Chinese, and this is something pretty extraordinary.
Yes. No,
and the whole idea of being forced to touch them,
yes. Yes.
Which shouldn't be feel forced. It should be a longing or a desire for that closeness and that intimacy that takes place in prayer. So that the social aspect, Ramadan.
I think there is no question that in all those
and
those
universalizing Ramadan, the idea that we're all 1/5 of the world's population is fasting.
Yes.
1 month out of the year together. I mean, you talk about harmonic convergence.
So, you spent about 10 years in
overseas, and then I came back here.
You came back to Northern California again?
Actually, Southern California.
I see.
And I studied. I was studying homeopathy, and then I was studying. I went into a nursing program and completed a nursing school.
Yes.
Program. Then I went. I was working in nursing, and then went back to the university to do a program in comparative religions. So
how long did that take for you?
Well, altogether it's been about 7 years.
Mm-hmm. So you finished that?
Yeah, I'm actually now going to probably, hopefully next year, be doing some graduate work.
Wonderful. So where are you finding all this time?
Well, it's making time for. I mean, I'm very time conscious. I'm conscious of the hourglass ticking away, so I just try to utilize in that insan. Absolutely, man is in loss with time is passage, except for those who don't waste their time.
That's right.
So I just try not to waste time. Yes. Time is very valuable to me.
What sort of relationship now have you got with your parents? Is that all?
Oh, wonderful.
Really?
Absolutely.
So
both my parents have a great. My sister became Muslim. All of my family now has a very good idea of what Islam is. And I've done it, I think, hopefully in a way that, I'm not condemning them or just I think they all have an idea of what my life's about. And I think all of them, they're very impressed with, it's quite difficult to have successful marriage in this modern 20th century, late part of it in California.
Yeah.
And, alhamdulillah, my children are, thanks God,
they go visit
healthy
their grandparents and all of that.
So I think, generally they're very pleased.
Yes. Well, that's nice. Now, coming back to Islam and, of course, its impact on your own life, which is obvious since you're quite actively engaged in learning and teaching. And now, what difficulties do Muslims have in presenting Islam to the West in a proper way? Because we talked earlier on about how Islam is perceived. We didn't talk about our own role or our own responsibility of how we have either failed or succeeded?
Good points. I think part of it is the fact that I think Islam's misperceived by the Muslims as well. I mean, it's not just a misperception that the Western people have, it's also a misperception that the Muslims haven't. Yeah. And part of that is the fact that Islam has been reinvented, or, you know, what they term in philosophy or religious studies, redacted, by late 19th century and 20th century modernist revisioners of Islam. People have been called the reformers, some people call them the deformers.
Who do you mean?
I don't really like to get into specific individuals, because I think you're dealing with, on the one hand, infiltration into the Islamic academic cadre, which is quite pernicious. But on the other hand, you're dealing with just, unfortunately, people that were caught up in the flow of what was happening. I mean, when the Muslims were defeated by the colonialists, this was a great shock to the Muslim Ummah. And I think what happened is suddenly they were having to deal with the fact we've been defeated by the Europeans, who for centuries the Muslims had looked down on them as being unworthy of even their consideration. And you can see some of the letters that were written by Muslim rulers, unfortunately, to the Europeans, really with disdain and loathing. And so, you know, I think that one of the things that God does is
but do you
he cures people with the thing that you know, with the medicine that they need to be cured, and the medicine of arrogance and pride. You know, the medicine is very bitter medicine. It's called humility and submission. And I think what's happened to a Muslim world that became very arrogant and very prideful, we have really been humiliated. And if we don't learn this lesson,
but have we? That's what my question is. I'm asking is that you say that our noses have been rubbed into the ground.
Yeah. And I don't think we've learned the lesson yet.
No, that's what
I'm saying. But,
okay.
But the wonderful thing about life is it keeps teaching you the same lesson over and over again. And unlike school here, where you can keep graduating on without having learned anything in the previous year, they'll put you to the next year. It doesn't happen in life. Life will just keep giving you the same lesson over and over again, and you get your diploma when you get the point. Right? And we haven't gotten the point, because Muslims still think somehow that La ilaha illallah it gives you some exalted position by the mere fact that you state that. Well, if that was true, then the hypocrites would certainly not be in the lowest portion of hell, because they say that too. So La ilaha illallah really on the tongue, saying it has no you know, no meaning unless it's emanating from the heart.
Doesn't get you any bonuses.
And if it emanates from the heart, it manifests on the limbs. And if it manifests on the limbs, you have a human being that's called a Muslim. And if it's not, you have somebody that the Quran clearly defines as a hypocrite, a munafiq. Somebody that, in fact, the way the Quran articulates is يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَمَا يَخْدَعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسُهُم. They attempt, and it's mukhada'a in the Arabic language is an attempt. They attempt to fool Allah and those who believe, and they only succeed in fooling themselves. And there's another version, which is the Warsh version, which says, وَمَا يُخَادِعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسُهُم, and they only attempt to fool themselves. In other words, that self-delusion ultimately, yeah, you can be self-deluded, but ultimately you know in reality what the truth is.
So then, you know, to summarize that, what we are saying here then is that the prevailing attitudes within the Muslim community is that they haven't really come to grips with the humiliating defeat, and therefore they will continue to.
And this is why we go around Christian bashing, which is a very common Muslim activity. You know, to feel good about ourselves, let's point out how horrific the Christians are.
Why isn't that there is a change? I mean, what is happening though? What do you think? Let's examine that.
Why isn't there a change?
Why aren't we looking?
Well, they say the best definition of madness.
Do we have the Rishava or?
They say the best definition of madness is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results.
Yes, that's
So
very
I
true
think
too.
in one sense we've been afflicted with a type of madness, and unfortunately post-traumatic stress syndrome is, it has deep repercussions, and I think the Muslim ummah as a body is suffering from post-traumatic stress
Yeah, but
syndrome.
then what are the remedies? Where is the CPR? I mean, we're now talking.
Where is the CPR? Well, you
Right.
need doctors and nurses for that. And this
Yes.
is a good point, because I
Yes.
think part of our struggle is the fact that we do not have any more institutions that are producing human beings of a brilliant intellectual caliber and a spiritual depth that can not only diagnose but also treat the patient. And traditionally, this has been the realm of the ulama al-amilun, who are called the awliya, the people that are close to God in their knowledge and in their action. And those people traditionally have guided the Muslims through their devastating periods of time. Well, you can see quite literally that, and I don't like to get into colonial bashing, because I think it's a real dead end for the Muslims. Victimization is a dead end road. But nonetheless, there are some important features that need to be looked at. And one of them is the fact that our libraries, our scholars, our khanaqas and madrasas and tekkes and all these places where there was spiritual preparation, intellectual preparation of the Muslims, they were literally shut down. And not only that, but the governments that were created, and Social Reform in Syria is a good book to look at, talks about this. The governments that were created by the colonialists, and this is the fifth column, which ultimately I've never seen historically, and historians would obviously verify this or negate it, but I personally have not seen historically where there was a conquering of a people without that fifth column element. And this is why the Quran says, "Hum al-adu fahdharhum qatilhum Allah," that the hypocrites, they are the true enemy, and may Allah destroy them. Because these are the people that have been complicit with the colonial enterprise and the neo-colonial, and we can almost say, why say neo-colonial? Because as far as I'm concerned, colonialism's never ended. It's just changed forms, because the chameleon-like nature of the West is one of its most extraordinary features, that it's able to change its form.
Its cloak, yes.
And this is what media and television is all about.
Yeah, well, that is now cultural imperialism. We will come to that. But then what you're again pointing out is that we are indeed in a double jeopardy, if I might put it that way. One is that we feel that there is a conspiracy that the West has on one hand. On the other hand, we do not seem to acknowledge that we are no more the power, and we are nothing in terms of amounting to anything in the scheme of things.
Well, neither was the Prophet's Medina in the 7th century, so we shouldn't forget that.
No, we shouldn't.
And the Quran very clearly says, "Kam min fi'atin qalila ghalabat fi'atin kathira bi'idhnillah." How many times have a small faction defeated a great faction by the permission of God? And so we have, the Muslims, if they're obeying their teachings and practicing, then they have a permission, they have an authority, which is very powerful, and we shouldn't underestimate it. But I think it's, it's a good point that if you look, why isn't anything happening? And I think part of it is the fact that if you look at the disease, which I feel the greatest articulation of it from the Islamic perspective is the word itself, which is used to designate everything that is against Islam, and that is jahiliyyah. And jahiliyyah is a word that in its root meaning means ignorance. And this is the whole argument of Islam, that you reject the truth out of ignorance, that you only do things that are bad out of ignorance. And this is Socratic teaching as well. I mean, even the Europeans have this idea that people don't do bad things if they really knew what they were doing. And this is part of what Islam does, is or what God does through Islam is literally to open the eyes of people, to let them see. I mean, one of my favorite things that's happened in recent popular culture is this Kathy Lee Gifford incident. And there was a wonderful picture of her in Newsweek that obviously got out of some television broadcasting, which is where she's got this horrified look, like, a shocked look when she finds out that she's been supporting child labor. This whole country is supporting child labor. The clothes we're wearing are supporting child labor. The tennis shoes that we jog in are supporting child labor. The soccer balls, the baseball bats that we hit our baseballs with. I mean, the whole thing is supporting child labor. Don't blame Kathy Gifford. Blame the whole country. Yes. You see, and this is what people don't want to deal with, is that, no, we have to look deeply at what's going on.
Well, so then this what you're saying, that, I mean, the example that you've used is of how should I say, of using people, or of abusing people to create to support the consumerism or what have you. But getting away from the because that brings us to the issue of justice and economic justice, and then the Quran. We'll get into that. But let us talk a little bit now of why is it that, looking at all of the Muslim countries, 50 and odd, 55, 56, I don't know.
Whatever the number is. They've grown in the last few years.
There still isn't either an awareness, one, or acknowledgement, or formulation of some kind of vision or strategy. What is our worldview now?
Well, this is part of the crisis again. Yes. I mean, we're an ummah in search of a worldview. One of the things that David Chittick, in his Vision of Islam, wonderful book, this is one of the things that he puts forward, is that the Muslims have lost sight of a Quranic worldview, you know, the Weltanschauung, of what, you know, it's not this, what Guy Eaton in the Islam and Destiny Man calls a Boy Scout religion. This is what we've been reduced to thinking that Islam is. It's going around doing good deeds. No, it has a way of viewing the world, a vision. And if you don't have the vision of Islam, no matter how sincere your efforts are, you're not going to be anything other than a glorified Mormon or a glorified, you know, Jehovah's Witness, or somebody who's out because they're doing good deeds. I mean, that doesn't, the moral element of Islam is not what makes us unique as a community, because every community has a moral element. No, it's the vision, it's what the tradition was called the aqidah. It was the understanding that Islam imparted to human beings, which enabled not only the morality to function, but also for there to be an absolute clarification of what exactly morality is. Because there's a great deal of confusion in our modern world, for instance.
But there is confusion within the Muslims too. That's
absolutely, because we don't have this thing anymore.
No,
so you're asking...
Not only that, but the thing that is interesting now is that there are Muslims, and there are pious Muslims.
Wonderfully pious.
Wonderfully pious.
Absolutely.
But then if you look at that, if you look at the whole world of Islam presently, these Muslims who are pious, some of them, very few of them, are also actively engaged in a social emancipation.
Right. Social justice.
Of the rest of the world.
Well, this is the separation of deen from millah. Because Islam has these two concepts. It has the personal, which is deen. This is our relationship with God. But it also has the millah, which is the collective group of what our goal is as a collective body. And the goal of the collective body is the establishment of social justice, right, which is called Sharia, the sacred law. Now, one of the things that you see...
No, but I want you to answer also.
This is important because we get back to this colonial idea. The Quran very clearly says, لَن تَرْضَ عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا نَصَارَ حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ. The Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, which is not religious, it's their social phenomenon, which I now think is Europe and America. This is the Judeo-Christian phenomenon. They will not be content until you follow their millah. Now, in the Quran, it does not say deen, which is their personal piety or their personal transactions with God. No, it says their millah, how they function as a collective body. Now, the dominant millah of our modernist condition is the consumer society. This is the idol of the age, consumption, that we were born to consume. Now, first of all, two interesting things to note. One is that consumer in Old English means the devil. And the Quran says, إِنَّ الْمُبَذِّرِينَ إِخْوَانَ الشَّيَاطِينَ. Those who are gratuitously extravagant are the companions or the brothers, the brethren of the sayateen, the shayateen, who are, you know, this perverse element in human society and in the human heart, which is calling people to lower functions. And so the idea of the consumption now is being presented to the world
the
as
need
salvation.
For consumerism.
As salvation. Right. That you will be happy through buying.
Yes.
That you will be happy if you will have all those goods that are going to make you
Correct.
happy. This is the constant message of the television, the constant message of media, the message of government. More. If we can just make more schools, if we can just put more computers in the schools, if we can just have more prisons, there'll be less crime. So everything is more.
That, unfortunately, is a part of capitalism.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, at its last stages. But what Islam is saying is no. By having less, you have more. By diminishing your exterior wants and increasing your interior wants, because we have interior and exterior wants. Our interior wants are not the same. Because if I'm cold, it's my body that's shivering. It's not my soul. And I can deal with that. I just put a blanket on and I can resolve that crisis. But if my soul is shivering, then what do I use to cover up that? Well, you can attempt to put a blanket, which is what consumerism is. You see, no, buy, and the blanket doesn't work. Well, here's a new and improved, right? This is what they love to use in their commercials. The new and improved blanket. This will really make you warm. Oh, this new car. Wait till you get this new stereo, this new television. It just keeps going and going and going. And in the end, this human being is left consumed. Because the consumer is ultimately consumed, because life consumes us.
What is actually the Quran, or how does one present the Quran to, say, a non-Muslim?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize about the Quran is that it's unlike any book. The Quran is in its own category, unique. It can't be compared to the Bible. It cannot be compared to Bhagavad Gita or any sacred scripture of any previous tradition, nor can it be compared to any book written by the secular traditions. So this is the first thing. One has to recognize that when one goes to the Quran, one is going to a unique book. And the first thing, also another thing...
Why is it unique, though?
Well, I'm going to get into that. I think also to recognize that it is a Quran before it's a kitab. It is an oral tradition before it's a written tradition. And there's things to recognize about oral tradition by their nature. One, oral tradition, the
linguistics,
No, in the oral tradition, the ear is what is designated, not the eye. In the linear tradition of writing, the eye is what is being designated. The oral tradition is to the ear.
To the ear.
And because of that, it is nonlinear. This is the first thing. The ear, by its nature, is a nonlinear organ. It takes in its entire surrounding sounds. The eye is a linear organ. It moves in, it focuses on through linear process. And so this is the first thing. The Quran is not linear by its nature, although there's obviously linear elements. I mean, because it can't be just, this nonsensical. No, they're randomness, yeah. But to the untrained eye, which is the linear eye, it does appear to be quite random. And this is why Westerners have been notoriously confounded by the Quran. If you look at
but that may be also their own mindset, and their own conditioning is towards a very structured.
Well, this is my whole point.
Right.
They're going to it with a certain expectation that it's going to be like the Bible. In the beginning, God created, and then boom, you get the history of the Israeli people, and then the New Testament are linear biographies of Jesus, right? And the Acts of the Apostles, all of these things. It's written clearly by a left-brained type creature, which is the human being who tends to write in linear forms. The Quran does not. The Quran moves from I to we to you to me. Fascinating, the perspectives, because there is no one perspective. It's multi-perspective. And this is because from the Muslim perspective, it's from God. And God is not encompassed, but God encompasses
everything.
And this is why the Quran is all-encompassing in its approach, and it forces you in a very powerful, shattering psychological perspective to be confronted with multiple perspectives. So it tells you what the non-Muslims say, it tells you what the hypocrites say, it tells you what the Muslims say, and then it tells you what God says. It's moving and shifting constantly. And so if you submit to the book, then you'll get something out of it. If you don't submit to the book, you won't. And I think that's really important for Western people to know. If you look just to a little more here, the very first chapter outside of the Fatiha, which is the opening, or the opener, the very first chapter is Baqarah, which begins Alif Lam Mim. If you look at any translation or interpretation of Quran, they say God knows what that means. So the book itself is beginning with 3 letters that nobody knows what they mean except God. And this is part of the demand of the Quran, that you have to submit to and recognize that your knowledge is limited.
Right.
And if you submit to that fact that you don't know everything, and if you submit to that fact when you go to the Quran, you're going to benefit.
Now, how should one then explain the message of the Quran in general?
I think the message could be summed up very quickly. The message is very clearly, in a sense, it's twofold. The first is that the human being has a responsibility towards God, and thus the message is La ilaha illallah, that there is no God but the one God, but Allah. And that is the primary message of the Quran, is Tawheed, right? And now, it's a radical Tawheed. It's not a monotheism that can be reduced to the Christian formula.
It's
or
uncompromising.
Yes, it's uncompromised, but it also, it does not limit it to a specific group of people that are, discharged with this trust, and nor is it moving into some esoteric metaphysic that becomes impossible for the common individual to understand. It's very clearly articulated. It can be understood by an unlettered, illiterate person. And so that's the first message of unity. The second message is, how does that unity transcribe into our lives?
Our daily life.
How do we manifest the unity of God? The first and most fundamental is the universality, or the unity of the human species, that we are one species, that we came from a unified source, which is one nafsan wahida. And the second is that, that God has given people diversity within unity, that just as God is diverse in his attributes and yet unified, the human species is also diverse in their attributes and yet unified. And within that diversity is belief and disbelief. And this is fascinating about the Islamic perspective, is that within the diversity of the human species is that there are those who reject God and there are those who accept him. So how does Islam deal with that? It says you have to accept their rejection. You have to accept that that's their prerogative. You should warn them that that's a stupid thing to do, but you have to accept that unless they begin to impose it on others. And this is where Islam steps in and says, no, you cannot sow corruption in the earth. You cannot take people's inherent fitrah, their inherent pure nature, this pure spirituality of the child, because children are spiritual beings by nature, and we turn them into materialists. One of the things the Prophet ﷺ said, I love about children is that if you give them mud or gold, it's the same to them. Children are not materialists, and we teach them materialism. They are spiritualists by nature. And so Islam wants to preserve the spirituality of the child. And this is called the amana, or the trust, the fitrah. And this is where the parents, it becomes incumbent upon them to preserve the child's purity and raise them in this fitrah, or this aboriginal nature, which is to worship God. Now, it's not enough for the parents to do it. The society has to cooperate as well, because you can't have a house where everything's fine and dandy, and you step outside of your house and there's so-and-so shooting so-and-so, there's so-and-so raping so-and-so, there's somebody dying of hunger. The Prophet said the believer's not a believer if he's satiated and his next door neighbor's hungry.
Yes.
So the point is that you want to go out and change the society, not simply for the fact of, it's a good thing to do to change society. No, but that your own presence, your own awareness of God is directly related to the societies in which you're living.
So then you have, what you're saying is that the Quran then makes it binding on followers
social
of Islam
activism.
for social activism.
Absolutely.
So that
it's an
part,
obligation. The Muslim, by definition, is a social activist.
Right. So, but then that part of Islam, or that part of a Muslim, cannot be uncoupled with
the spiritual.
In
fact, it's a pseudo-spirituality. It's a false spirituality.
Yes.
You see, if you're in the mosque or the church or the synagogue and worshiping God, and then you go out and all around you is just the horrific conditions of human society. It's like the Hindu sadhu who's up in the forest, meditating on primordial nature and the widows being burnt on the funeral pyre. No, you can't have that disembodied spirituality without having to recognize that there's an obligation that goes with the knowledge of God, and that is that God's attributes should be manifest on earth.
So that there is no withdrawal from this world.
There's no
is
withdrawal.
Active
Absolutely
engagement.
not. And traditionally the Muslims have never withdrawn. In fact, the spiritual element of Islam, which has generally been tasawwuf, you'll find that in the tradition that the Sufis were the greatest social activists in the Muslim world. I mean, the great examples of that are people like Imam al-Nawawi, Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi of the last century, right. Shaykh Uthman Danfodio, who was a Qadri Sufi, and he was out engaging in establishing the deen of Islam. So this modern Sufic phenomenon, which I would term folkloric Islam, which has reduced, this pseudo-spirituality in the tombs of saints and et cetera, is just has nothing to do. It's an aberration.
Yes. We'll visit that topic, Sufism, a little bit later, but let's stay with the Quran a little bit more. Now, we talked in general about what the message in the Quran is, how it is acted out by Muslims. It obviously has different versions of it, or different ways that Muslims have interpreted it. What comments do you have, and is that a source of confusion or to the others? Or
one of the nice things of the many great, wonderful things about the Quran, but one of the very clarifying aspects of the Quran is that there are two types of verses in the Quran. There's hazy verses and there's clear verses. Yeah, so the Quran is already telling us there are two ways that you can go to a book. You can go to it for this nebulous, esoteric interpretations, or you can go to it to get something out of it that you can use in your life. The Quran very clearly says, as for those who have deviation in their hearts, they follow the hazy things. But those who are firmly grounded or firmly rooted in knowledge, they believe in the hazy verses, but that's not the verses they're interested in. They're interested in, how do I apply this book in my life? And this is why Imam Malik, radiallahu anhu, the great theorist, and not just theorist, but jurist, practitioner and jurist, and philosopher of law of Medina, he was totally uninterested in theoretical ideas. If somebody asked him a question, he said, did it happen? And if they said no, he said, then I'm not interested. He wanted, how do we live this deen? Not theory. How is it applied? And this is clearly delineated in the model of the Messenger of God. I mean, this is why the Prophet's seerah and his sunnah, which is his life, history itself, but also his sunnah, his normative practice, is essential to the tradition because it is the Quran walking. It is the embodiment. It is the enactment of the Quran. So if I want to understand the Quran, I have to look at the best and greatest exemplar of the Quran, the paragon of the Quran itself, who is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And once you enter into his life, you see, this man is incredible. This man is extraordinary. No one's ever lived like this man. No one has ever worshipped God like this man has worshipped. No one has ever been a father, a husband, a military ruler, a statesman, a governmental ruler, a teacher, a student. He is literally fulfilling all of the possible human roles. He's a nurturer because there's a side, and I don't want to use the feminine word just as a trivializing aspect, but there's a side to the Prophet ﷺ that he's called rahmah, a mercy to all the worlds in the Quran. And mercy is very clearly a feminine attribute. And one of the things that his detractors used to say about him is that he was effeminate, that he, for instance, they said he urinated like a woman, things like this. They described him as being more modest than a virgin before her coming out. And so the Prophet had this although he had a very majestic, jalali, masculine presence, quality, nonetheless, he was the most balanced of human beings. So he was not this patriarchal, austere, monumental figure that human beings did not have access to. He was gentle. He was sweet. Right. He smiled.
No, he was quite different from the Old Testament.
The Old Testament prophets. Their versions
with God or something.
Their versions of those prophets. Right. He was a human being that smiled. When the man was in his presence, began to shake, the Prophet just said, relax. He said, I'm the son of a woman who used to eat dried meat in the marketplace. Right. And this is the way he comforted the people around him. So you have in him a model. We know how he slept. We know how he got up. We know how he dressed. We know how he brushed his teeth. We know the fact that he flossed. All gum disease and all the things that afflict people at these fundamental levels. We know the fact that he defecated and urinated sitting down. These are not trivial matters. We know the fact that he put pressure onto his colon and recommended people to do that. We know now in Western physiology that polyps and the problems of diverticuli that are very prevalent in Western conditions are actually quite uncommon. And they're often attributed to high fiber diet, which I don't believe.
Well, let's not talk about it. I'll be here giving you the talk. Let's reverse the roles again.
But my point, just the point is that at the most fundamental level, we learn how to live. We learn how to go to the bathroom. We learn how to brush our teeth. We learn how to be with our wives, how our wives should be with the men. We learn how to be with our children. I mean, these are guidances that people now make fortunes writing books in self-help sections on how to, how to live.
I get the idea that, since he was the embodiment of the Quran, one's understanding of the Quran should come through also reading or taking account of his life. That's what...
that is the first and primary source. In fact, from one point of view, one can say that you could live your life with the deepest understanding and embodiment of the Islamic tradition without ever having once read the Quran, by simply just following the...
wait a minute. Now you're saying something which I've got to understand this better. Are you saying then that if one read the Prophet's life and...
I think that there are many Muslims historically who have lived their lives
without reading the Quran,
without ever having read the Quran with understanding, and have fully embodied the essence of the Islamic
now you qualify
teaching.
that. You see, you're qualifying that a little bit. I find it troublesome because I think, at least from what I'm looking at, is that if you do not read and understand the Quran, which is the fundamental reason for us being Muslims, then regardless of anything.
What I'd like to say is simply that the Quran, first of all, is a very difficult book. It's not of easy access. And any great tradition, this is true of their sacred literature, and certainly, and I think more importantly, about the Quran. The first thing is the Quran cannot be understood without the Arabic language, quite literally. And yet Islam can be understood without ever having known Arabic. So my point about that is not to make some shock statement. No, I'm just quite clearly articulating that I believe very sincerely that a person can be a Muslim and embody the depths of Islamic spirituality and Islamic efforts towards social justice and the realization of social justice without having read the literal book of the Quran.
Yes, but you see, I have great difficulty accepting that, because I think then the Prophet would not have left behind the Quran when he said this day, in his last this thing, he said, I'm leaving the Quran.
Yes, so, but the Quran is a worldview. And you can read the Quran your entire life and never understand that worldview.
Well,
and you cannot read the Quran in your life and understand that worldview. And that's my point, because I think the vast majority of Muslims have been non-Arabs, and the Quran has only recently been translated. We should remember that the Quran traditionally was not translated into other languages.
Right.
And yet I believe that all over the Muslim world we have had people living and manifesting Islam at its deepest spiritual levels without having access to that. So I think that the Quran itself is a formidable book that it can scare a lot of people. The message of Islam is not a complicated message. It is a very clear message. And traditionally, the message of Islam has taken by people who understood the Quran, and these are called the shuyukh, or the leaders. The Quran itself commands us to follow these people. The Quran, for instance, says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ ذِكْرٍ كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people who have knowledge of this teaching if you don't know.
Yeah, but I have difficulty with this concept, though, because I think that one of the major setbacks for the Muslims is just this whole idea that only the shuyukh or ulul albab or what, but because the Quran is also saying that this is hudal lin-nas. And how do you...
Who are the Nas?
Yeah, well, Nas, how do you translate
according
that?
to Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, he said they were the people of understanding.
Well,
they're the people that guide people. I think if we try to democratize
not democratize. I think if
I mean, there's a hierarchy in understanding. For instance, you're a specialist, so you can understand this. You don't want an internist butting into your area of specialty. Not because he might very well be quite a clever guy.
No, but you see, I think that analogy, allow me to say that, but then you are comparing apples and oranges. That is...
No, this is the modernist approach. See, one of the things that the modernist approach has done is it has eliminated the sense of a spiritual and intellectual hierarchy within the Islamic understanding, and that is not true. During the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there were only 7 people that were known to give fatwa, which is a legal judgment. The vast majority of the Sahaba did not.
But then fatwa, I agree with that. Well,
a lot of people...
We'll stop here for a minute.
A lot of people don't agree with this. They think they can go right to the Quran and simply open it up, and
they give a fatwa. No, we'll come back to this in a second.
All right.
We were talking about the Quran, and you made a statement earlier on, which we've discussed. Let's just clarify that. Are you saying that we need not read the Quran and we should go just straight to the Prophet's life, or you want to...
No, I think my point that I was trying to emphasize is the fact that when the Quran permeated the Muslim societies, it was possible in the Islamic civilizations for illiterate people to be embodiments of the Quranic virtues, of the Quranic worldview, without really being able to articulate it, because it had so much permeated the cultures and the societies. That is no longer the case. We're in an age where the Muslims have been so alienated from the Quranic tradition, and that's why I think this age in particular, it's actually essential to go back to first identifying what the Quranic worldview is, because that needs to be articulated and identified, and then to engage ourselves in attempting to implement it in our lives, because initially it's going to be artificial. Yeah. It has to move to a natural state, just like it was with the Sahaba. I mean, initially there was an element where suddenly they're thrust upon looking at their own ignorance and then recognizing there is a cure, an antidote for it, and that's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. You know, moving from Jahiliyyah, from the age of ignorance, to Islam is not something that took the Prophet ﷺ 23 years of very serious, diligent, continuous work to take those people from. And I would submit that the ignorances and the darknesses of this age are much more sophisticated and deeply embedded than they were in the Arabian Peninsula of the 7th century.
Interesting. Now, you talked about the worldview. Is it the luxury only of dominant cultures to be able to articulate the worldviews, and for that reason we are unable to do so? Or what is that?
Well, that's a fascinating topic itself. Yeah. How is it? Because there is a certain intellectual sophistication that goes along with articulating, and this is the anthropological approach. Let's look at what exactly all this means. Let's examine why do these rituals exist? Why do these, and so abstracting something to a level. And I think that's a really excellent question, because what it forces us to do is look did the Muslims really ever identify or articulate clearly what the Quranic worldview is? And I would contend that they did. It was done at a very high intellectual level amongst a certain cadre of scholars, but the fact that a group of them knew and could articulate what it was does not mean that the whole society was not permeated with it. I think it was just perhaps it was at a cellular level, because our cells have memories as well, right? I mean, our cells know to do certain things, and not whether or not our brain is consciously aware of the fact that the cerebellum is making sure that things are functioning at the bodily level. I mean, I might not be conscious of my breathing. A very common spiritual technique was to make people consciously think about their breathing, because it's something we don't really think about. So I think that the brain is functioning, this triune brain that we have is functioning. We've got the neocortex, which is conscious. And then we've got these other two brains, the R stem, and we've got the midbrain that are functioning at a less conscious level. Right, the primitive brain. So I think that you could look at the Quranic worldview that permeated the Islamic civilizations was more like the primitive brain. It was just happening. But I think there were intellectuals that were looking at it and understanding it. Yeah, but there would have to be, or else it couldn't have permeated in the way.
Well, but I think the permeation also perhaps is a function of a hegemonous culture, which is all prevailing. Then, on its coattails, drags all these ideas in and shapes and formulates a worldview.
Well,
so
part of what the Western
we were on the top of the heap, and we were able to do it. That's what I'm contending here, and I'm saying that now we are not on the top.
But we weren't always on the top, and it was already happening at the point the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran, or the Quran rather, and then the Prophet ﷺ clearly articulated the disease of the 7th century Jahili culture. It's very well articulated. And so there was a Jahili worldview that was definitely, it was deconstructed in the postmodernist jargon. It was deconstructed in the Quran. And then an alternative worldview was presented very clearly, very consciously by the Prophet ﷺ through the Quran, or rather by the Quran through the Prophet ﷺ. And so I think that the Prophet ﷺ is historically a complete anomaly, because we have no individual that has done what he did in the time that he lived in, out of the people that he came from, and nowhere even near. I mean, we can't compare any of the religious leaders, whether it's Jesus, whether it's Buddhist, nor can we compare the secular leaders, whether it was Thomas Jefferson or Napoleon or Genghis Khan or any of these great world leaders. We cannot compare them to what the Prophet ﷺ did, because the man, peace be upon him, was working at the highest intellectual levels, and yet he was an unlettered man, a man of the masses, a man of the people. He was not an abstracted scholar. He was not a man of books. But the intellect, the piercing intellect, and we know in our Aqidah, or the creed of the Muslims, one of the beliefs of the Muslims is that the 4 characteristics that the prophets must have, and one of them is fatana, which is intellectual brilliance.
No, talking still now about the Prophet, since you brought up his topic. How do you see him, say, in terms of modern history, in terms of what is happening to our lives now, in terms of technology, in terms of science? If I was to say that he is living now, what would he say? What would he do?
Well, first of all, we can't say that. I personally don't believe this is. I've heard this used, and it's, to me, it's unfair. It's not. He would do exactly what he did in the 7th century. I don't think the methodology would be any different, because ignorance is ignorance. And we can, by analogy, we can see
that's precisely where I'm heading.
By analogy, we can see that the propaganda tools of today are not dissimilar to the tools of yesterday. They've become more sophisticated. The television camera is certainly more sophisticated than the propagandists that would go and spread disinformation. Now they can do it in the editing room. They don't have to do it with the story, how they change the story. They just simply edit out what they don't want to be told, and they edit in what they want to be told. So, the techniques of kufr are not different. In fact, the Quran at one point says, did they conspire? Atawasaw bihi? Did they conspire to do this all? Because they do the same thing every age, every period. And the Quran says, no, they're just qawmun taghun. They're a people who transgress boundaries. And you can only transgress certain ways. You can die of overeating. You can die of being oversexed. You can die of becoming a criminal. And there's only certain
excesses.
Yeah, there's only certain ways. Even the body. I mean, as a physician, there's only certain ways that excess shows up in the body. There's certain ways that deficiencies show up in the body, and they're very. And even modern diseases that perhaps were not known prior to that are still. They still show up in the same cellular type breakdowns and the same type. They just have different permutations and manifestations, but ultimately it's the same. It's the same process.
So then, you know, in terms of ideas from the Prophet's life, what would work now, if we are going to draw on analogies, is obviously his commitment that you just talked about, and not only that, but also what other aspects of his plan that he had you think that Muslims should be looking at?
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize that there is a methodology. There is a methodology. And the Quran articulates that methodology in several cases. One of the best examples of it is that it says that he was sent to the mass of people, the unlettered peoples. Who are the masses of peoples? If you look at the world today, the United Nations has identified 3,000 languages. Out of those 3,000 languages, there are only 78 that have a literate tradition. And even of those 78 that have literate tradition, the actual number of literate individuals is quite small. Now, one of the phenomenon of the last days, according to the Prophet, is that literacy would become widespread. But do we identify what the United Nations calls literacy as true literacy? I don't think so. I think people are semi-literate or functionally literate people. But the tools of literacy, which is abstraction and the ability to analyze and to think, are not being given to people. In fact, I would contend that the oral cultures had better analytical skills than a lot of the, because there's an indoctrination, a propaganda that goes along with modern,
yes, but then
with modern education.
But when you say indoctrination, you take away the conceptualization, the freedom of thought, and a number of other processes which in oral cultures may not have surfaced, and this is why maybe one of the reasons we are backward now.
Yeah. Well, the Prophet, again, to look at this example, it says he was sent amongst the ummiyin, the unlettered people, يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِ, to recite to them the signs of God. This is the first stage. You have to tell people that there are signs of God, and we need to learn how to read them, because reading is not simply reading the book, but it's reading the signs. وَفِي أَنفُسِكُمْ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ, in your own selves, don't you read the signs? As a physician, you learn to read signs.
And understand.
And understand what they mean. So the world is a sign itself, but what is it signifying? It's signifying the unity of God, and people need to learn how to read that language, which is the language of unity. And it's there, and it can be learned. It's not a difficult thing, and there are many Muslims that have learned how to do it, and so they see it. And once you recite the signs, a group of people will respond to the signs. There will always be a group that respond. That group will continue to increase until it reaches a critical mass. Now, while it's increasing, there's a process that happens to take. Yuzakkihim or yuzakkihim. There has to be tazkiyah, purification. And this is what fasting, what prayer, what recitation of Quran, what doing struggle in the way of God. These are all the processes of purifying. So you have to have an element within the society that is actively engaged in transforming themselves and those around them. And if there's not, nothing will happen. And then, وَيُعَلِّمُهُمْ. While that and the wow here is not for tartib. In other words, in the Quran, it doesn't mean it's all happening simultaneously. So the purification is going on while the teaching is going on. It's not one follows the next. No. And that's why that grammatical point in the Quran exists. While they're being purified, what else is happening? يُعَلِّمُهُمْ الْكِتَابِ. They're learning the book. Now, one of the things about learning the book is learning how to perceive. Learning the ability to become critical of the world you're living in. This is like Paulo Freire's work in South America with illiterates, was simply giving them the tools of articulation. If you don't know what the concept of exploitation is, how can you know that you're exploited? If you don't even have the concept in your brain, how can you perceive the fact? Now, once somebody teaches you that word and connected with it as a concept, they've empowered you.
So there should be meaning behind the word.
Absolutely. Suddenly, you're empowered with a word, I'm being exploited.
No, but that is my point, you see. This is why I'm coming back to the same question or the same dilemma that a lot of us, say from the point of view of Indo-Pakistani culture, we all read the Quran. It's a word, but we don't have the meaning behind it. Or we are not learning or acting or implementing the meaning.
Absolutely.
And this is a very serious...
And there is no Quranic worldview being manifested in the culture. It's a Jahili culture.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With big crises. Yeah. And then the final stage right? And not the final stage, but it's simultaneous with these stages, is يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابِ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. And the Prophet teaches them not just the book, because it's one thing to know the critique. We can all sit around on our armchairs and criticize the world.
Right.
How do we turn that critique into something constructive that can become transformative by its nature? And this is wisdom.
Right. Well, hikmah is probably more comprehensive than wisdom.
Much more comprehensive,
right.
Yeah. But again,
yeah. Now, coming back to Islam now, for those who don't know what Islam stands for, can you then tell us what are the core beliefs in Islam besides the worship of one God? Very simply stated, how would you?
Well, I think for to explain to a non-Muslim the most basic or fundamental beliefs, it's quite clear that they've been articulated by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the famous hadith that or the prophetic tradition that Omar records, and it's the second one in the 40 hadith, in which the Prophet was asked by Jibreel, what is Islam? And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, replied, Islam was that you bear witness. And testimony or witness, if you look at it in the Arabic word, it says an tashhad. And tashhad means to see, that you see that there is no God but Allah. And that takes perception. And the Quran says, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there is no God but Allah. So it's not something we say on our tongues. It's something
we know, intuitively feel.
Understood deeply. And then that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the messenger of God. And this is accepting that not only is there God, because many people believe this, but no, there's also a way that has been articulated by that God in which he wants to be worshipped and in which he wants you to live amongst each other with. And that way is called Islam, which is submission to him. And that submission is, the foundation of it is in the next four things. And the first one is prayer, that you have to pray together communally as a people, that a society should be based on prayer. The Islamic society revolves around prayer. We are the last people left that pray on the earth in a sense that it's happening continuously.
But not necessarily communally all the time, though. If you can, you can, but you...
Yeah, but it's very important.
Right.
The emphasis on communal prayer is very important. It's been lessened in this modern time. The importance of praying together as a group can't be underestimated. And then the next is that you pay zakat. So not only do you have a personal relationship with God, but there has to be social effect of that prayer as well. So you have to give out charity. You have to establish institutions. You have to change the social conditions around you. You have to make sure that the poor people are not being unjustly treated. And that's all embodied in the concept of zakat, which is related to purification. So you purify the society. You purify yourself by giving out of your wealth, because wealth is what transforms the human condition. And we shouldn't have any illusions about that. It's wealth that maintains this television program. And if it cuts off, then the television program cuts off. And that's why the Quran is all about giving, right? So there's this idea, no, if you want to change something in society, you better put up or shut up. But Islam doesn't need lip service. So it's the idea of a commitment to social change that's proven by your pocketbook, by what you actually put out, right? And the Americans say, put your money where your mouth is, right? And so that's what zakat is saying. That if your prayers, you're praying to God, but there's no money there, God doesn't need your prayers. You need your prayers. At
least for those who can afford to, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
And the other ones are praying that they're going to give them money.
Right. That's correct.
So the next one is fasting, which happens 1 month out of the year. And this has to do with a commitment also to your body. That the body is something that has to be honored and purified. Because we really harm our bodies. And you could spend hours lecturing on, the gross abuses that take place with overeating and consumption, these things. So learning to discipline the soul, that's what Ramadan is about, disciplining the lower self. And because you need disciplined people. If you're going to practice this religion, it needs discipline. And that's what Ramadan is. It's the school of self-discipline. And then the pillar of Hajj, which is basically that once in one's life, they will direct all of their energies towards moving towards the house of God. And this is symbolic of our journey to the next world, to death itself. The Kaaba is an empty black cube in the middle of a desert. And you literally go there to circumambulate that house and go through these ancient rituals that connect you to the beginnings of humanity, which is the simplistic, non-superstitious, ritualized worship of God, which is following the Abrahamic way, because the pilgrimage is a celebration of Abraham. It really is. It's a celebration of Abraham. And it's a celebration also of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's purification of the Abrahamic tradition. And then standing at the plain of Arafat, which is standing before God, just as we will in the next life, and have to deal with the fact that we spent however many odd years on this earth, and we will have to be taken into account, and we will have to literally justify our lives and our existence. And that's the basic foundational structure of Islam. And the rest of it, you have your dietary laws that are very simple, not complicated.
No, but what about before the laws? What about the hereafter and salvation?
Then you move to the next stage, which is Iman. And this, the Prophet was asked, what is Iman? And Iman, I don't like to translate it as faith. I think it's a much broader term, but it's generally translated as faith. The idea of a belief, but an existential belief, not just an intellectual belief, something that's really permeating the entire body. A belief in Allah, in which Allah's presence is felt, that it's real, that God is real. And in fact, one of the names in the Quran for God is Al-Haq, the real. And the next then is understanding that God has an angelic realm. And the idea of the angels is not, I think the pictorial representation of angels in the Judeo-Christian, or really the Christian tradition, I think is really very deleterious to the Islamic understanding. The Islamic understanding of the angelic realm is that this is a hierarchical realm of pure light, that they're beings of pure light. They're neither male nor female. They don't eat, they don't sleep, they don't procreate, and they function to maintain order in the cosmos. And this is a realm that we believe in, and we're commanded to believe in. We also believe that there are, at the time since puberty until we die, that there are angelic beings that are literally recording all of our actions, one on the right and one on the left. And this is not, we don't believe this is some kind of fairy tale or imagination. And it creates, if we become aware of the angelic presence, then we recognize, and when we pray 5 times a day, we say to each side, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, peace be upon you. And so that part of that is to become aware of this presence, that these angels are with us, and they're recording our actions. And although God does not need them to record our actions, God puts them there as a way of maintaining this type of presence and this understanding, and also recognizing that the world is hierarchical by nature. And then the other is that there have been prophets and messengers. And in the Islamic tradition, there are some traditions that indicate 124,000. Most say that the number's not exactly known, but 124,000 indicates that there have been a great number of prophets. We believe that every human community has had a prophet. The indigenous people to this land had prophets. The Chinese had prophets. The Europeans had prophets. All peoples had prophets. And that the Prophet Muhammad is uniquely the only non-provincial prophet. He's the prophet that transcends boundaries and barriers. He is the universal prophet.
And their message was basically the same.
Yes. Their message, their laws differ, but their truth teaching is always the same, that there's no God but God. We will die, we will be raised up, we will be taken into account for our actions. And in fact, a lot of mythology, in fact, like one of the things that the Christians always had difficulty with the myth of Gilgamesh, the Gilgamesh epic, where they think it's a myth of the first traditions of Noah's Ark. We would say that the Gilgamesh epic is a garbled version of the pure and original. It's not that that the biblical story comes from the Gilgamesh epic. No, it's that the Gilgamesh epic comes from an ancient, more primal story, which is the flood story, which is also universal. So the myths of the flood are from a real event that took place. So we believe in these things. And just about the universality of the Prophet Muhammad, although we do accept the people of the book and the Christians, we still, in our tradition, we believe, as is modern Christian research confirming, that Jesus was in fact not a universal messenger, was sent to the Jewish community in particular, and he was universalized after his death by Paul and by others. So, modern research has confirmed that traditional Quranic worldview. And then we believe that there are books, that the messengers don't come and then disappear, but they leave behind them something that we have access to, and this is getting back to the idea of the Quran. So we have access to the divine communication through a book that is left behind by the prophets. And the final book, although there were also several books, and many of them we don't know, there are 4 that we have to believe in, which is the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible in their original form, because we do believe that all books but the Quran have the potential of being changed. So there are things in there that might not be in accordance with the original teaching. And then the Zabur, or the Psalms of David, the tradition of Jesus, which is one gospel, Injil, not the 4 gospels, but one gospel we believe in. And some now call it the Q, the gospel of Q, or the Quell gospel, the source gospel, which was the original oral tradition. And then the Quran itself, which is the final one. Now, about other traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, I think most of the Muslims, although traditionally they did think that they were probably prophetic traditions, and we don't deny them, but they've become so distorted and changed.
Adulterated.
Yeah, adulterated, that it's difficult to say what was true and what was not true from them. And then from there, you have from the Iman, you have the next degree of Islam, which is called Ihsan. And Ihsan is the science, it's the psychology of Islam. It's learning how to break away the delusional barriers that human beings walk around with, so that we learn to combat 4 enemies. These are the natural enemies of the human being, which is the nafs, or the illusory ego-centric self. This is the artificial construct that's a result of years of people putting on all of these excrescences that, and then the hawa, which is the downward motion. Hawa in Arabic means to move downward. It's the downward motion. It's that element in ourself that's pulling us to the lower energies.
Basic instinct.
Basic instinct. People become obsessed with things that are harmful for them. And this is not to negate our sexuality. It's not to negate the sensual aspects of our lives, because the Prophet Muhammad encouraged those things within the generous boundaries of Islam. So we don't fornicate. We don't abuse women for men. For women, they don't seduce men, and vice versa. So there's basic respect that is and then it's limited to marriage. There's no extramarital activities and things like this. And also pornography and all the
that is base. All that is.
So that's hawa, and then you have the dunya, which is the illusory world, not the alam. The Quran differentiates between 2 worlds of nature, and the other is this illusory world that entices us and makes us think that it's permanent, and yet in fact it's quite ephemeral and fleeting. And learning how to deal with that. And then finally, shaitan, which is a fascinating subject and one of endless discussion. But shaitan, there are 2 elements. There's an external element and an internal element. And shaitan is the internal mechanism which exists within the rest of the human being, which works at the impulsive level to pull the human being away from the higher nature. And then the external shayateen, which are the shayateen inside, work outside, who are humans that have completely surrendered to the worst aspects of their nature and capitulated entirely to those 4 enemies, and they work to sow corruption in the earth. So these would be people like pornographers and world with loans and these type of things, and also warmongers. The Prophet said the one who sells weapons during the time of sedition is in the hellfire.
Whoever sort of creates
doing
the fitna
corruption,
or fasad.
fitna, yes,
right.
Sedition.
What about the hereafter, and how one? What is the concept?
Well, I think the word in Arabic, akhirah or darul akhirah, is the final abode. And it's the idea that this is a transitory abode, that here it's impermanent. The final abode is the permanent abode. In fact, the day of judgment is called the last day, because after that there's not passage of time. And so basically the human being is given a choice in this life to build his house. He builds his house. He either builds his house in a lush, green, paradisical place, or he builds his house in a wretched, raging place. And no choice, but we are our own carpenters. We build the houses of the next world, and we have no one to blame but ourselves. And this is the choice that human beings are given. And so Islam basically says there is a garden and there is a fire. And this is what it calls it. It doesn't have hell or no, it's just a garden and a fire. In people who turned away from the truth in this life and denied the truth, that is their final abode. And the garden is the place for those people who embraced the truth and submitted willingly, not unwillingly, because everybody's in submission unwillingly. They submit willingly to the truth. And there's a middle group mixed with right. And the Quran says, Asa Allah an yatuba alayhim, that God helps decide, but no, he'll have compassion with them because they were struggling with themselves. So the people that God condemns in the Quran are those who don't struggle, those who capitulate. We're not, all struggling in ourselves. And the Quran recognizes that. Islam recognizes that you will do bad things. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, all of you do wrong, and the best wrongdoers are those who turn to God.
There is then the notion of resurrection.
Absolutely, that's soul. And according to Islamic tradition, when we die, and it's the Great Awakening, in fact, this world will seem like a dream, although it's not a dream. We're Hindus and we don't believe that this is a dream. It has a dreamlike element in relation to the next world because the opening is so great. So literally when the soul reaches إِذَا بَلَغَتِ الْحُلْقُومِ, at that point the Great Awakening occurs, and suddenly we realize the truth. And this is what the Quran very clearly and beautifully articulates, or majestically, that we will realize the truth. And at that point, the human being, there's no tawbah at that point. إِذَا غَرْغَرَ, that's what that reaches that point. Not to leave, you realize the truth. And you see the angelic realm, and you see the angel of death, and truth hits you, and it seizes you by the throat. And suddenly there's no turning back. And at that point, the soul...
The course is committed at that point.
Exactly. We have no longer... Soul leaves to the tradition and hovers over the body. And this has been confirmed by people that have had near-death experiences. They felt a hover over the body. And the Prophet Muhammad said the soul will hover over the body. And then there's not a reuniting until it's put into the grave. And then it's reunited and it goes in the grave. And the questions in the grave will be, who is your Lord? What do you say about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And then you asked about your actions. And at that point, the grave is your first indication of what your true state is. It will either be a beautiful meadow, or it will be a pit tradition. All the people in their graves, and when we pass by graveyards, we remember this, all the people in their graves are waiting for the great resurrection, which is when all human souls, the big crunch, like they call it in modern physics, when the meltdown, the heat death, unclear that the oceans will boil over, right? So the heat death is described in the Quran, and when that happens, all the souls are raised up, and there will be the world, and we know it's limited in its lifespan, dies, and then people are brought forward. This is not God is not in a direction. We're not anthropomorphous. We don't give God human characteristic or images and things like this. Islam totally hates all of that. So we will not see God like linearly or front, back, these type of things. But according to the Quran, we will see God.
Will be brought back.
Yes.
So the next question, how does the Quran or how does Islam see good and evil?
This is the traditional. This is called in philosophy. They call it the problem of good and evil.
Right.
And it's a bugbear for the Christian tradition because it gives an authority or a power that's akin to God's. Mm-hmm. In Islam, we believe that God is the creator of good and evil, mm-hmm. and God, in a sense, is beyond the concepts of good and evil in this world, because it very clearly says in the Quran that you might consider some things to be evil and in them much good for you. So we might see a flood or a tornado as something evil, or a child gets drowned or something like that. You might think it's evil. That's not us to make. It's not judgment. Almost in a sense, although we condemn, and the Quran gives clear ethical guidelines for what's right and what's wrong. We condemn murder, we condemn rape, and we condemn stealing, and we condemn all the virtuous things that every tradition believes in. That's condemned in Islam. But there's also this idea that I think is best articulated by the person as the animal of the carpet's wonderful design. In other words, when the ant is crossing the carpet, it doesn't see the magnificent design because it's too limited in its perspective. And this is the same. We cannot see the vast, extraordinary design of God and the plan of God, lives and intellect. So I think ultimately the question of evil is that it is a test from God. There is evil in the world. It exists as an entity, and it was created by God, and it is a test. Just as the pig is a form that God created. Believe in a universe. There is a purpose, but we are told we can't eat that animal. Why? That's God's business alone. And say, well, trichinosis and things like that. But ultimately, we don't really give it an interpretation. God has prohibited for us the eating of pig. So I think evil is like that. It exists. And when we see it, we recognize it. Like we recognize the foulness of the pig and how it lives, we recognize the foulness of evil. And we are told by God not to do evil, just as we're told not to eat the pig. And yet, unfortunately, in the world, there are pig eaters, and there are those who don't eat pig.
Yeah. What about the notion of sin?
I think the closest word in Arabic, sin is a Christian term, but the closest word in Arabic is probably dhanb, and dhanb comes from a root word which to leave behind, and it's a tail. It's the idea of something, and the tail is related to our bestial nature. And so sin is really, it's like the bestial nature that we leave behind. And I think that wrong actions, but it also gives us the ability to turn away from them at any time. So that ultimately wrong action is something human become minor as we increase in our spirituality until they're left to just what are called lamam in the Quran, which are very subtle things, but grows from like adultery, like drinking alcohol, like usury, taking usury from people, gambling, these really crude things. These are not difficult. Human beings, if not millions, attest to this fact.
And not forgive.
According to Islam, God will forgive every wrong action, including whether the person forgives you is another matter, because that's to be settled on the day of judgment. Yeah. Every murdered person has their day in the great court, but God will forgive murder. The forgive, we forgive it.
So you mean you're saying that God's forgiveness is justice?
Ultimately, the Quran says this. say that.
And what
Quran says, my mercy is over my wrath, and wrath is related to justice. So the only thing that Islam will not, that Allah will not forgive, according to, is that God. And this is why unity of God is to see God as one without partner or attribute.
We'll have